So our Bible reading was in 2 Chronicles. That's where we started. So I'm going to ask you to get your Bibles open there. It's an Old Testament book. The book of 2 Chronicles, chapter 33, I believe, is where I'm going to start. And if you just open to that point while we just learn a few things about this king, Josiah. Had you ever heard that name before? Some of us have, maybe some of us haven't. Josiah was very young, as we saw in the scripture reading there. If you look at 2 Chronicles chapter 34, what we read there was Josiah was 8 years old when he became king. Well, we're going to look at a little history on who he was, who was his father, what happened, what caused this to happen. And Josiah is an interesting young man. And the beauty of it is he was a young man that had a burden for doing what was right. He wanted to serve the Most High God. And the land of Israel, the nation of Judah, these places had just become corrupt, very corrupt. It's interesting that the name Josiah means, may Jehovah heal. It could also mean Jehovah has healed. It can mean either one. May he heal or he has healed. Sometimes in these Hebrew names there's a little confusion as to what it can mean literally. But that's what the name Josiah means. Jehovah has healed, or may he heal. And I would say that, we pray every week for people. And we ask for our Most High God, Jehovah, to heal people. We've seen him heal people. Our friend and brother Jay is a testament to that. And he knows that. That's what I love, is he recognizes that it's by God's glory that I'm here. I feel the same way. I'm here because of what God has done. I know I've said that a lot, but these are things we don't want to forget. I was texting, Sister Lorena texted me last night. I send out my message every Sabbath evening, and she texts me back. And she says, "How are you doing?" And I used the line that I stole from somebody. There's a guy that he's on the radio, and he says, "Better than I deserve." And it's true. I'm better than I deserve. And she asked me, "Wow, is there something that I don't know about?" And I said, "Well, not really." I said, "I think that, when I look back on my life and I see the things that have happened, I shouldn't be here. I should have died a couple of times." And I've really been blessed in that regard. So when we look at Josiah's name, Jehovah has healed, or may he heal, think about that as we look through this Bible account. So 2 Chronicles chapter 33, this is where we're going to start, 2 Chronicles 33, and this is going to give us a little history. There was a king named Manasseh, and we're just going to read some verses. We're doing quite a bit of Bible reading today, but you'll see this is a very interesting, it's not just monotonous Bible reading. Sometimes you get into these lineages and things, and it can be really, it gets you bogged down. But listen carefully to what happens here. Manasseh, in 2 Chronicles 33, verse 1, it says, Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king. And first of all, you think, wow, 12 years old. What 12-year-old could run a country or run a nation? Would you want a 12-year-old today running the country you live in? I wouldn't. So, when we think about those things, but of course he had counselors and advisors. There were people around him. But it says Manasseh was 12 years old when he became king, and he reigned 55 years in Jerusalem. But he did evil in the sight of Jehovah, according to the abominations of the nations whom Jehovah had cast out before the children of Israel. For he rebuilt the high places which Hezekiah his father had broken down. He raised up altars for the Baals and made wooden images, and he worshipped all the hosts of heaven and served them. So you can see here that Manasseh started off with this horrible relationship with God. He brings all these false gods in. He's worshiping them. He's setting up altars to false gods. Pick up in verse 6. It says, also he caused his sons to pass through the fire in the valley of the son of Hinnom. He practiced soothsaying, used witchcraft and sorcery, and consulted mediums and spiritists. He did much evil in the sight of Jehovah to provoke him to anger. So it's almost like he's doing it on purpose. He was worshiping false gods. This provoked Jehovah. This made him angry. Verse 7, he even set a carved image, the idol which he had made, in the house of God, of which God had said to David and to Solomon his son, in this house and in Jerusalem, which I have chosen out of all the tribes of Israel, I will put my name forever. So in the house that Jehovah says my name will reside, Manasseh takes this out and he puts up false gods right there inside the temple. What has to happen for something like that to take place? Do people just follow? Or is everybody in this world just a bunch of followers? Do we just, somebody does wrong, well, it's okay, I'll veer off to this way, is that how we are? A lot of people are. It's easy when the masses are going in one direction for us to just walk along and follow them. It's hard to stand alone and say, you know what, I'm going to worship the true God no matter what. But that's what God expects of us. Well, the account goes on. It's not all bad as we continue. Notice verse 9. It says, so Manasseh seduced Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem to do more evil than the nations whom Jehovah had destroyed before the children of Israel. So they were the worst of the worst. They were just getting worse and worse, and things just kept going. But look at what happens in verse 10. And Jehovah spoke to Manasseh and his people, but they would not listen. So here we have this king that's doing these wicked things, and Jehovah actually speaks to him. Speaks to his people. And it says in verse 11, therefore Jehovah brought upon them the captains of the army of the king of Assyria, who took Manasseh with hooks, bound him with bronze fetters, and carried him off to Babylon. Now when he was in affliction, he implored Jehovah his God. Remember we talked the other week about when we're in trouble, we tend to pray. You know, I asked the question about how many of you have checked your spare tire lately. We talked about that. But we would expect it to have air in it. Well, here, this king, he's rejected everything that God has ever done. He's done everything wrong. He's put up false idols in the house of God. And now he's in trouble. Who's he call on? He didn't call on Baal. What's Baal going to do for him? He didn't call on those idols that were in the temple. No, he calls on the one true God. He calls on Jehovah. It says, notice what it says here. Again, it says in verse 12, now when he was in affliction, he implored Jehovah his God. Isn't that interesting? And humbled himself greatly before the God of his fathers and prayed to him. And he received his entreaty, heard his supplication, and brought him back to Jerusalem into his kingdom. Then Manasseh knew that Jehovah was God. So what did it take? It was a change of heart, we could say. He did a self-examination, and he humbled himself. He gets on his knees and he prays to God. And even though he'd done all these horrible things, God answers his prayer. And he takes him back, sets up his kingdom. Verse 14, after this he built a wall outside the city of David on the west side of Gihon, in the valley as far as the entrance of the fish gate, and it enclosed Ophel, and he raised it to a very great height. Then he put military captains in all the fortified cities of Judah. He took away the foreign gods and the idol from the house of Jehovah, and all the altars that he had built in the mount in the house of Jehovah and in Jerusalem, and he cast them out of the city. Verse 16, he also repaired the altar of Jehovah, sacrificed peace offerings and thank offerings on it, and commanded Judah to serve Jehovah, the God of Israel. Wow. He's restored pure worship. That's what he did. He went wrong. His father was a righteous man. And then he goes and he does all these wrongs. But what happens? He comes back. God will take you back. Like the prodigal son's account in the New Testament that Jesus talks about. Verse 17, nevertheless the people, so the king repents, but it says the people still sacrificed on high places, but only to Jehovah their God. I find it interesting that their gods were these false gods. But Jehovah is allowing them to come back. It's never too late. No matter where we are in our walk, no matter what we think, no matter if we look at ourselves and we say, I can't. I've been there. I've been to the point where I thought, I don't know if I can come to God or not. There have been times in my life that I didn't feel worthy to pray. That's right where the devil wants you. He doesn't want you anywhere near the feet of the Father. He doesn't want you coming before him. Well, Manasseh ends up, he naturally lives out his life, he dies, and then we find Ammon, his son, becomes king. Well, Ammon was 22 years old when he took over. It tells us that in verse 21. And it tells us in verse 22, notice what it says, but he, that's Ammon, did evil in the sight of Jehovah, as his father Manasseh had done. For Ammon sacrificed to all the carved images which his father Manasseh had made and served them. Well, it's interesting. I thought Manasseh got rid of these things. But see, his son no doubt knew the things that had taken place. It shows the example that we set for our kids at a very young age usually will stick with them. You know, the scripture says, bring up a boy in his way and he will return to you. He'll never forget. He might not come back. But let me tell you, when those things are instilled in us from a young age, we never forget them. I remember things that we were taught as kids that stuck with me through all of my life. And I was, just this morning, we were talking, and I said that. I said, you know, one thing that I'm grateful for is the whole time I grew up, I'll never forget, I was taught the whole time that when you're alone, you're not alone. God always sees everything you're doing. So just because you're in a little room and you think, well, I'm by myself, I can get away with doing this thing, whatever it is, you might try to deceive yourself into thinking it, but you're not alone. So those things that I was taught from my childhood stuck with me, and they stick with me to this day. And I think that's what's kept me from getting into trouble. That's what kept me realizing, wait a minute, yeah, I'm by myself, but God knows what's in here and what's in here. And we're judged on the secret things, we're told in Ecclesiastes. So perhaps Ammon, from his childhood, saw these idols. He saw these things. Maybe it was appealing to him. Well, it ends up here. Look at verse 23. It says, he did not, that's Ammon, did not humble himself before Jehovah as his father Manasseh had humbled himself. But Ammon trespassed more and more. Then his servants conspired against him and killed him in his own house. But the people of the land executed all those who had conspired against King Ammon. Then the people of the land made his son Josiah king in his place. And you say, Josiah, this is a young man. It says here, it's a boy, actually. We read verse 1 of chapter 34. He was 8 years old when he became king, and he reigned 31 years in Jerusalem, and he did what was right in the sight of Jehovah and walked in his ways as his father David. You see, David is the lineage of Ammon and Manasseh and all of these men that we're talking about. Hezekiah, all these men were from that lineage. In fact, let's take a look. I want you to see a New Testament text. I'll put this on the PowerPoint for you. Matthew chapter 1. This is where Josiah is mentioned in the New Testament. Matthew chapter 1, this is the lineage of Jesus, and I'm just taking verses 6 through 11. It says, David, the king, begot Solomon by her who had been the wife of Uriah. Solomon begot Rehoboam. Rehoboam begot Abijah, and Abijah begot Asa. Asa begot Jehoshaphat. Jehoshaphat begot Joram. Joram begot Uzziah. Uzziah begot Jotham. Jotham begot Ahaz. Ahaz begot Hezekiah. Hezekiah begot Manasseh. Manasseh begot Ammon. And Ammon begot Josiah. And it goes on. Josiah begot Jeconiah and his brothers about the time they were carried away to Babylon. So you see the time of this is probably around 600 or so BC that this is reflecting back on. So just to simplify it, instead of all the begots, if you look on the left side and come down that column, and then on the right side and come down that column, this is the lineage. This is how it works out. It was David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Joram, Uzziah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah. So this is interesting. This is the lineage we just read. So when it talks about his father David, we know that David was one that wrote a lot of the Psalms, and he was a man after God's own heart. We know David had a lot of blood on his hands. He did a lot of bad things, but he came to the Father. He came back to God. Even though there were things in his life, he asked for a new heart. So let's take a look here at this Josiah, and let's just see. We can go back to, I think, yeah, you don't have to show that, Zach. We'll just leave it at that. Let's take a look here at 2 Chronicles, chapter 34, and we'll just take a look at verse 3. And in the 8th year of his reign, so when Josiah was 16 years old, while he was still young, he began to seek the God of his father, David. And in the 12th year, so now he's 20, he began to purge Judah and Jerusalem of the high places, the wooden images and carved images and the molded images. They broke down the altars of the Baals. Wow, this sounds familiar. This is what his grandfather did. They broke down the altars of the Baals in his presence, and incense and altars were above where them he cut down, and the wooden images, the carved images, and the molded images he broke in pieces, and he made dust of them and scattered it on the graves of those who sacrificed to them. He also burned the bones of the priests on their altars and cleansed Judah and Jerusalem. And so he did in the cities of Manasseh, Ephraim, and Simeon, as far as Naphtali, and all around with axes. He had broken down the altars and the wooden images and beaten the carved images into powder and cut down all the incense altars throughout all the land of Israel. He returned to Jerusalem. He was serious. He didn't just destroy them. He ground them to powder. He ground them to powder. Well, in this process of trying to clean up this worship, of trying to make the kingdom something pure, something that God would accept, notice what happens in verse 8. It says, in the 18th year of his reign, so he's 26 years old now, when he had purged the land and the temple, he sent Shapha, the son of Azaliah, Messiah, and the governor of the city, and Joah, the son of Joahaz, the recorder, to repair the house of Jehovah his God. When they came to Hilkiah the high priest, they delivered the money that was brought into the house of God, which the Levites who kept the doors gathered from the hand of Manasseh and Ephraim, from all the remnant of Israel, from all Judah and Benjamin, which they had brought back to Jerusalem. So you see, he brings this money back. He's trying to restore the house of God. This is what his objective was. And he brings all of these people together. They come in to work and to serve. And take a look here at what happens while they're there in verse 14. Now when they brought out the money that was brought into the house of Jehovah, this is 2 Chronicles chapter 34, verse 14, Hilkiah the priest found the book of the law of Jehovah given by Moses. He stumbles across this thing. This has been misplaced. It wasn't found for a long time. This long-lost manuscript was found by Hilkiah, the high priest, while this building and these extensive repairs are going away at the orders of King Josiah. You see, Manasseh had set these statutes aside. He had put them aside. That's why he could go to worshiping the false gods. They were put aside during his reign. And through careless neglect, they were misplaced. They should have never been misplaced. So I want you to take a look at this book of the law. I think I've got this here. Oh no, that's not where I want to go yet. I apologize. I'll get back to that. So they found this book of the law of Jehovah given by Moses. Look at verse 15. Then Hilkiah answered and said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of Jehovah. And Hilkiah gave the book to Shaphan. So Shaphan carried the book to the king, bringing the king word, saying, all that was committed to your servants they are doing. In other words, things are going really well. Good progress. Things are moving along. That's what he says. Verse 17. And they have gathered the money that was found in the house of Jehovah and have delivered it into the hand of the overseers and the workmen. And Shaphan the scribe told the king, saying, Hilkiah the priest has given me a book. And Shaphan read it before the king. Thus it happened when the king heard the words of the law that he tore his clothes. He was in grief. He couldn't believe how far they had gotten from the word of God. When he heard these things that were read in his ears, that were read in the ears of those Israelites many years before, he realizes, how did this happen? How did we get that far away? And this whole roller coaster ride throughout the Old Testament, if you read some of these accounts, there were kings that were good, there were kings that were, it was just up and down and up and down. There's pure worship, there's horrible worship, there's pure worship, back to false worship. I mean, just back and forth. And God keeps calling them. And he keeps trying to draw his people. He does it over and over and over again. Why am I talking about this that happened so many years ago? 2,600 years ago. Why is this important today? Because it's happening today. That's right. More than ever. There are more people alive on the earth today probably than have ever been in history. I don't think anybody would argue that. But there are probably fewer people that are worshiping the pure way than ever in history. Is that possible? I can't say that for sure. But if we look at the ratio, I'll bet you the ratio is definitely skewed. The percentage that are worshiping the true God and the restored pure worship versus those who are worshiping the Baals, some unknowingly. Many of the people that were in these kingdoms, some of them didn't know. Some of the ones that were growing up, they had grown up in there. This was all they knew. It was normal for them to worship false gods. These things are so important, friends. Time is drawing close. Time is drawing close. It's not a time to be fooling around. So let's continue here. So the king, he was so distraught, he tears his clothes. In verse 20, then the king commanded Hilkiah, this is 2 Chronicles 34:20, Achiham, the son of Shaphan, Abdon, the son of Micah, Shaphan, the scribe, and Asaiah, the servant of the king, saying, go, inquire of Jehovah for me, and for those who are left in Israel and Judah concerning the words of the book that is found. For great is the wrath of Jehovah that is poured out on us, because our fathers have not kept the word of Jehovah to do according to what is written in this book. He recognized how far they were removed. Look, this is the book we have today. When we look at the morality of the world and we look at this book and see what this says versus where we are, do we have that same type of feeling that Josiah was feeling? We should. We should be disgusted by the things that have become acceptable in this world today. There's so many things, and it's normal. It's perfectly normal. Oh, it's just the way it is. It's not the way it's supposed to be. It doesn't have to be that way. Verse 22, so Hilkiah and those the king had appointed went to Huldah, the prophetess. This is a lady prophet, the wife of Shalem, the son of Tokath, the son of Hazra, keeper of the wardrobe. She dwelt in Jerusalem in the 2nd quarter. It says, and they spoke to her to that effect. Then she answered them. So here she's answered. She's giving them, she's a prophetess. This is what she says to them in verse 23. Thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel. So in essence, she's saying it, but who's speaking? Jehovah speaking. It's God. So when a prophet speaks and says, thus says Jehovah, we'd better tune in. We better tune in and listen. Right? So this is what she says. Thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, tell this man who sent you to me, thus says Jehovah, behold, I will bring calamity on this place and on its inhabitants, all the curses that are written in the book, which they have read before the king of Judah. You know what that reminds me of? Revelation 22:18. Revelation 22:18. And it just hit me. As I'm reading that verse just now, Revelation 22:18, here's what it says. For I testify to everyone who hears the words of the prophecy of this book. That's almost what she says here. If anyone adds to these things, God will add to him the plagues that are written in this book. And if anyone takes away from the words of this book of the prophecy of God, he shall take away their part from the book of life, from the holy city, from the things which are written in this book. Is that much different? So we're hearing an end-time message here in the Old Testament. So that's what she said. I will bring calamity. This is Jehovah speaking on this place. She's prophesying this. On its inhabitants, all the curses that are written in the book which they have read before the king of Judah, because they have forsaken me, in verse 25, and burned incense to other gods, that they might provoke me to anger with all the works of their hands. Wow. Is Jehovah being provoked to anger today? Just look around you. Turn on the radio, turn on the news. I'm not telling you to do that, but I'm just saying if you're listening to those things, yes, you're going to see that. Look around. And notice here in verse 26, but as for the king of Judah who sent you to inquire, this is 2 Chronicles 34:26, to inquire of Jehovah, in this manner you shall speak to him. Thus says Jehovah, the God of Israel, concerning the words which you have heard, because your heart, speaking to Josiah, because your heart was tender and you humbled yourself before God when you heard his words against this place and against its inhabitants, and you humbled yourself before me and tore your clothes and wept before me, I also have heard you, says Jehovah. You know, when it says humbled yourself in the Hebrew, it says you got on your knees and bowed before me. That's a humbling position. You know, we don't always kneel when we approach the Most High God. Sometimes I stand, sometimes we sit. But there's a time to kneel. And there's power in prayer. And when numbers like us, when we come together and we get on our knees for that intercessory prayer, and everybody is bringing their praises and their requests before God on your knees, he hears you. So because your heart was tender, you humbled yourself. So Josiah restores pure worship from all of these horrible things. You know, this is what ministries like this one are trying to do today. You know, I don't think that, according to the Bible, we're not going to accomplish everybody today accepting, I should say, the truth. Not everybody will accept it. But eventually, guess what? Pure worship will be global. It'll be around the world. That's what we're promised in Isaiah 66. That's what we're promised throughout the ministry of Jesus, that pure worship will again be restored. But these people who are wanting to live their own lives, live their own ways, be selfish, not humble themselves before God. You notice verse 27 again, because your heart was tender. Josiah was a contemporary of Jeremiah. Jeremiah had the understanding that his heart had to be changed. David had the understanding, his great-great-great-grandfather knew his heart had to be changed. Put in me a clean heart. Josiah evidently got it. And isn't this the message we've been preaching? That we have to have the heart, it has to be in here. We have to allow Christ in. That's how pure worship is restored. It starts in the mind and in the heart. And then it reflects outward. So this, I want you to know too that here in 2 Chronicles, let me fast forward, just so you have this. You don't have to show that if you don't want, but in these verses, these are parallel. In 2 Kings chapter 23, if you want to read more about the restoration of this, it's the same account. And you can read it in 2 Kings chapter 23, verses 1 through 25. But notice here in verse 29, it says, "Then the king sent and gathered all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. The king went up to the house of Jehovah with all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem and priests and Levites and all the people, great and small, and he read in their hearing all the words of the book of the covenant which had been found in the house of Jehovah." Does that sound familiar? It says, "Then the king stood," in verse 31, "in his place and made a covenant before Jehovah to follow Jehovah and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and all his soul, to perform the words of the covenant that were written in this book." He meant business. He wanted to do the will of God. That reminds me of Matthew chapter 22, the greatest commandments. To love Jehovah your God with your whole heart, your whole soul, your whole mind. That's what he's saying right here. This is what I want to do. That's the greatest and first commandment. Right? And the second one is to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, obviously he loved his neighbors because he commands everybody. I want everyone to know this truth. He brings them all with him. Reads it in their ears so that they hear it. In verse 32, "And he made all who were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin take a stand. So the inhabitants of Jerusalem did according to the covenant of God, the God of their fathers. Thus Josiah removed all the abominations from all the country that belonged to the children of Israel, and made all who were present in Israel diligently serve Jehovah their God. All his days they did not depart from following Jehovah of their fathers." Isn't that a beautiful account? He wanted to share the gospel. And that's what he did. He restored pure worship. What's he do immediately after that? Not long after that, he keeps the first Passover in pure worship. You see, this was something that was sacred to them. I find it interesting. He knows the gospel. Now he's going to point to Christ. Isn't that amazing? The things that we find in the Old Testament when we just look for them. Look at chapter 35, verse 1. It says, "Now Josiah kept a Passover to Jehovah in Jerusalem. They slaughtered the Passover lambs on the 14th day of the first month." Nice hand 14. That's what this is. So they had that celebration. Pure worship being restored, pointing to the coming Messiah, recognizing that this was going to happen. Now, I want you to turn just a few books prior to 2 Kings. I told you about 2 Kings chapter 23. 2 Kings 23, and I want you to notice verses, there's so much here, but I just want you to notice verses 22 and 23. It says, 2 Kings 23:22 says, "Such a Passover surely had never been held since the days of the judges who judged Israel, nor in all the days of the kings of Israel and the kings of Judah. But in the 18th year of King Josiah, this Passover was held before Jehovah in Jerusalem." So it said this had never happened to this degree before. What does that mean? Pure worship was restored at that moment. This was a celebration like they had never had before. I have to believe that. That's what it says. He keeps the Passover. And when we commemorate the Last Supper, the communion, this is what we're doing. We're recognizing what he recognized. But we're looking back at what was done. He was looking forward as to what would be done. So it's a beautiful thing when I look at these things. Some Bible translations will say that this happened in April, but it could be March or April, depending on where the full moon was at that time. There's so many things in this. Well, a little bit more about Josiah. He actually ends up dying in battle. But before I get there, remember I said never before had they had a celebration like this. I want you to notice this text. Deuteronomy 30:19, I call heaven and earth as witness today against you, that I have set before you life and death, blessing and cursing. Therefore, choose life, that both you and your descendants may live. I'm showing you that text because Josiah seemed to understand that there was a choice to be made. He had seen what the kings of the past had done. He'd seen what the people had done. And I find it interesting that this part of the law, this is actually in part of the law that Josiah was reading. If you study this, you'll find that this was actually part of it. God is saying, look, you've got a choice. And he's saying, choose life. It's a choice. Choose it. So Josiah was urging God's people to choose God's way of life, that they might become a praise in all the earth and a blessing to all the nations. Isn't that what God's asking us to do today? It's no different. It's the same account. We're living it now. We're living it now. These things are put in scriptures for a reason. And the interesting thing is he did this all in the hearing of Moses in the Old Testament. If you remember, the law was written in the hearing of Moses and all of the Israelites. And what did it say? What you say we shall do. Josiah brings it forth and he reads it and he says, this is what we're going to do. We come here to church and we listen to a sermon and we say, this is what we're going to do. And we walk out the door and, well, we'll start again next week. We'll promise it again. We'll do it again. I mean it this time. I've done it. I'm guilty. Guilty as charged. But friends, what I'm asking is, consider this the beginning of that walk. The beginning of restoring pure worship. We're working on it, right? And worship begins in here and in here. So I have to fix this before we can fix this. This has to be fixed. So look inward. That's what I have to do. And then once I do that, pure worship can begin to be restored around us. And Josiah set a great example. He did outward things, but evidently he did inward things because he fell before Jehovah and he asked, can you do that? We might not want to. We can do it. We can do it. We can ask the Father to send the Spirit of His Son into our hearts to change us. We were talking about that during Sabbath school. We were. So, just so you know what happens here, there was a battle in the valley of Megiddo. Just to kind of wrap this up a little bit, verse 24 of chapter 35. Look at how this ends. His servants therefore took him out, that's Josiah, out of that chariot. That's 2 Chronicles 35, verse 24. His servants therefore took him, that's Josiah, out of that chariot and put him in the second chariot that he had. And they brought him to Jerusalem, so he died and was buried in one of the tombs of his fathers. And all of Judah and Jerusalem mourned for Josiah. They loved him. Verse 25, Jeremiah also lamented for Josiah. And to this day, all the singing men and singing women speak of Josiah in their lamentations. They made it a custom in Israel, and indeed they are written in the laments. You know, Josiah is remembered as a righteous man that came before God, that poured his heart out, that was much like David as far as being a man after God. He knew by the history that was written, by the lineage, by the things that were passed down, who David was, no doubt. So this young boy, at 8 years old, was made king. And it didn't go to his head. It shows how God can work with anybody. No matter how young, no matter how old. Don't ever feel, well, I'm too old to get started now. Sometimes we may feel that way. We may feel that way. The lesson to take from this, friends, if you get nothing else from this, the change begins with the inward person. Josiah came before Jehovah and he bowed down. He humbled himself. His heart was tender, it says. My heart's not always tender. I think most of you know that. But when he did that, Jehovah says, I have heard you. I have heard you. I told you, I've never heard the voice of God. I've never heard God speak to me. I do believe that he has spoken to people, and he may still do so. I never doubt that. When somebody says, I heard the voice of God, I don't doubt it. I'm just telling you, I've never heard it. But I will tell you that there have been times in my life where I've gotten on my knees and I've said, Father, I can't do this. But I'm giving it to you. I can't do it. And to be honest, I really don't want to do it. But I'm claiming the promise that you will help me to overcome. That's what I'm asking of everybody here. That's all he's asking. Think about that. Do a self-evaluation. Think about where you are in your walk. Think about the things, and that's what I've had to do. Man, there's so many things in my life that prevent me from walking into that kingdom. If I could walk in, they'd say, oh, you got to stop right here, buddy. Here's your list. And it'd be long. It would be long. So, a dear friend of ours that I love very much, her name is Pat. And I think I said this, and I don't know if I said this before Sabbath school or during, but she said to me one time, she said, the prayer that we need to pray is that God will show us ourselves. And she says, I've prayed that prayer, and I didn't like what I saw. Well, if you knew Pat, you'd say, how could you not love Pat? Isn't that true? How could you not like what you see? I mean, she's just a lovely person. But it's true. God knows us better than we know ourselves. We have to ask him to show us who we are and get us ready for that kingdom. And if he shows us who we are and we learn who we are and we make efforts, he will help us overcome it. He will get us through that. We overcome, then we can go to others. And it doesn't mean you can't share with others now, don't get me wrong. But that expression will reflect. When I mention Pat, anybody that knows Pat says, I want to be like that. I want people to be able to say that about me and about you and you and you. I want to be like that person. So when we look at our Lord Jesus, isn't that what we say? I want to be like him. Well, when people see us, that's who they should see. That's the point. With Josiah, it seemed like that's the man he was. Restoring pure worship. Easier said than done. But with the help of God, with God, all things are possible. Amen?